Thank you.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Steveston-Richmond East.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, let's deal with the elephant in the chamber here. There are reasons to support euthanasia despite 21st century medical advancement, but to protect the vulnerable in our society from mistreatment or abuse, we must provide the service ethically and monitor its delivery scrupulously. What we debate here today is exactly the opposite of that. C7 seeks to amend medical assistance in dying by eliminating various safeguards on how and when the service is delivered, and with apparent disregard of any scrupulous requirement. Some of the offensive changes to end-of-life decision-making include removing the 10 days waiting period between MAID requests and its administration, allowing for no reflection or opportunity for consultation on alternatives during this critical period, proceeding without immediate consent, thus removing the final opportunity for someone to change their mind, and the creation of a two-track approach, the first track being someone whose death is deemed reasonably foreseeable, a term which is subjective and lacks effective meaning, as the Truchon case in Quebec reviews. The second track allows individuals who do not meet the reasonably foreseeable death criteria to receive MAID. At least these individuals are granted the opportunity to reflect for 90 days. I voted against second reading of C7 because it does not adequately protect Canadians from harm, and the gap presented is it's way too wide and to be bridged. Unfortunately, as I had predicted, this government refused to accept any reasonable amendments submitted by concerned stakeholder groups. I will therefore be voting against C7 during this third reading as well. As has been said many times, this bill creates pathways to end of life and would significantly impact the disabled without sufficiently supporting the alternatives. It also does not include enough consideration for the rights of medical professionals to refuse providing death as a service. Doctors know their patients' most intimate details. They have the professional experience to make suggestions on treatment and know how to refer to other experts when necessary. Because of MAIDs, medical professionals such as Dr. May, who is a stroke neurologist, have expressed concerns that doctors aren't being encouraged to suggest the best treatment. They're being obligated to suggest and provide a treatment that they may not believe it's the right one for any patient. They are being told to kick their conscience to the curb. In this regard, Madam Speaker, I would quote someone who, according to CBC, has 2 law degrees and a master's degree in health policy and has helped develop health law and policy for the WHO and several governments. He has practiced medicine in Canada, Africa, and the South Pacific. The member for Thunder Bay Rainy River shares the mutual concerns how this bill addresses the issues faced by those transient or undecided in their end-of-life decision-making. He states, and I quote, "My biggest concern is that as someone who has spent his whole life trying to avoid accidentally killing people, is that we don't end up using MAID for people who don't really want to die. That as someone with medical background, he thinks it is morally incumbent upon himself to stand up when it comes to issues of health, life, and death. Perhaps this concern is something that should be addressed through review. It's been said here in this chamber recently, and I repeat, that any legislation that is introduced in Parliament requires a thorough review. But that is especially true for bills that are literally matters of life or death. Bill C7, which seeks to expand medical assistance in dying, it's one of those bills. Members of the Justice Committee have heard firsthand from disability advocates vehemently opposed to C7 and its rapid expansion of MAID. They argue it amounts to a, quote, deadly form of discrimination, making it easier for persons with disability to die than to live. It is shameful that in the Liberal government's rush to pass the bill before December 18th, they continue to neglect to address the legitimate concerns being raised by persons with disabilities and medical professionals. Conservatives are focused on ensuring that this type of legislation includes safeguards for the most vulnerable in our society and for the conscience rights of physicians and health professionals. I have previously outlined these reasonable amendments we have introduced to reinstate such balances the government has removed. So I'm not going to relist them here again. However, I shall repeat that it is essential the government begin a separate and comprehensive parliamentary review of the original 2016 MAID legislation and the state of the palliative care in Canada. It is critical that this review analyze how the government's MAID legislation negatively impacts persons with disabilities. I might add, such a review could have taken place over the last summer, but instead, the Liberal government shut down our parliament to hide from their ethical scandals, only to return and introduce this legislation from scratch again. What larger lapse of moral fiber and ethical decision-making could there be? Furthermore, Madam Speaker, it pains me to find this bill comes at a time when vulnerable Canadians, such as those in palliative care, are more isolated than ever. Because of the pandemic, they can be left alone in their room for days. These measures aimed at saving lives have left them looking for options. As in the case of Miss Nancy Russell, a 90-year-old long-term care resident in Toronto who received MAID simply because, quote, she did not want to go into another lockdown, according to media report. Fleeing from the communist regime in Shanghai, my father struggled to provide for himself and his family by learning and mastering the art of directorship in the early film industry in Hong Kong. He later worked in Nigeria when I was a teenager and only returned home after suffering from a major stroke. I witnessed his struggle firsthand to live and to attempt to regain independence with little familial resources or societal help. My father was a fighter. He also overcame cancer and other major medical problems before dying in his sleep in Saskatoon one early Sunday morning in the 90s. If this C7 MAID legislation had existed back then, he would have been under inhumane pressure to, quote, lessen the burden he was imposing on his family, unquote, even though his death was not reasonably foreseeable. I, for one, Madam Speaker, am grateful for his strength and determination to stay alive so that I could reciprocate the care he provided me when I was young. He was able to live long enough to hold my brother's firstborn, his very first granddaughter, only months prior to his natural death. Medical assistance in dying, it's a very complex issue and evokes strong emotions. Recognizing we need more time to review the bill, my Conservative colleagues and I repeatedly propose increasing the number of meetings dedicated to reviewing the bill and hearing from witnesses. Unfortunately, each time, the Liberals refused. Canada's Conservatives will continue to highlight the flaws in this bill, which threaten the lives, rights, and dignity of people with disabilities, long past this unfortunate legislation. We will continue working to protect vulnerable Canadians, especially persons with disabilities, when the next assault on their dignity arrives. Canadians deserve as much. Like many of us here, my constituents have approached me in earnest to express their opposition to C7 and MAID. They asked for their MPs to stand in defense of the rights of people with disabilities, highlighting that it is a discriminatory policy and that Canada should not stand for such discrimination, that we must not expand euthanasia to people who are not dying. They asked me to stand in defense of the conscience rights of doctors, hundreds of which are protesting C7 as being against their oath to protect.
I have to interrupt the honourable member because we have to go to questions and comments.